Throughout human history, a lot of giant empires were formed, they thrived, and eventually collapsed. A good example is Mongolia, which was one of the biggest empires in the 12th century, but it collapsed in a way where Mongolia is somewhere nowhere to be found, and it's nowhere important. The current borders of Mongolia are so horrendous that in the 1950s they requested to join the USSR, but to our surprise, the Soviets declined their offer and said we have to think about it first. You probably know that Stalin wanted to add every square inch of the world to the USSR, and it's very surprising that they didn't even want to take Mongolia in. The main reason the Soviets didn't accept Mongolia to their land is because their border with China would be much larger and that would cause more problems. But in this video, we're not talking about empires that collapsed in a way where their landmass is much smaller. We want to talk about empires and countries that no longer exist today. A lot of people claim Germany is the one that started World War I, but that's not exactly true. The First World War was started by Austria-Hungary, a giant empire in Europe that ruled here for almost a century. The country wasn't just Austria and Hungary, there were many more countries, like the north of Yugoslavia, a part of Poland, a part of Romania, and a little bit of Ukraine. When we get to 1914, a Serbian citizen that's a part of Austria-Hungary kills Archduke Ferdinand in the city of Sarajevo. Who the hell is Archduke Ferdinand? Well, he was a very important person in Austria-Hungary, and he was going to be the next emperor. After this took place, the Austria-Hungarian army attacked Serbia. When Austria-Hungary moved south towards Serbia, it created a chain reaction for other European nations to go to war as well. And this pretty much caused the entire continent of Europe to go to war. But usually, Germany is at fault for starting the war. Why is that? Because after this took place, Germany declares war on Russia. And when everyone is expecting Germany to attack Russia, they all of a sudden attack France. This war caused three empires to collapse: Austria-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire, and of course the Ottoman Empire. It's insane how this took place. A random Serbian kills Archduke Ferdinand. In a span of 4 years, three giant empires collapse. But let's go to the next country that no longer exists, Czechoslovakia. And by the name alone, you should know what it is: a combination of Czech and Slovakia. When Austria-Hungary collapsed, the Slovaks and the Czechs get together to form one country. They also choose Prague as their capital city. When Austria-Hungary is formed, it starts off with a strong economy because most of Austria-Hungary's industry was in this part of the land, and that is why they start off strong. This country is doing good until we get to World War II. At first, the Germans occupy it and it's under Nazi Germany. And after Nazi Germany is defeated, it goes under the USSR. Even though Czechoslovakia didn't go communist, but it was still part of the Eastern Bloc. After the USSR collapses, the Czechs and the Slovaks decide they should separate as well, and very peacefully separated from one another. Another country that doesn't exist anymore, Vermont. You might say Vermont is a state, what do you mean? Yes, in the year 1777, the government of Vermont didn't want to be a part of the British Empire, and they didn't want to be under the United States, and that is why they went solo. They write their own constitution and actually produce their own currency. At that time, the American government didn't do much about it and just watched them closely to see what they're doing. But after a while, the people of Vermont realized that if they're under the United States, they're going to be much stronger and better off. And that is why they asked the US government to accept them back in as one of their states. Next to the Indian Peninsula, there is an island that you probably heard of. Back in the day, they used to call this island Ceylon. Throughout history, Ceylon was part of India. And when you get to the Portuguese era in the 14th century, they take over Ceylon and add it to their empire. After the Dutch throw the Portuguese out and take over this island, the Dutch stay here until the year 1815. And that's when the British show up and kick the Dutch out and take over the Indian Peninsula plus this island. After a very long time, meaning 1948, Ceylon gains independence from the UK. When we get to 1972, the people of Sri Lanka decide they want to change their name to something that belongs to them. Because Ceylon is a Portuguese word, and the Portuguese gave it this name. And that is why they chose Sri Lanka. And after 1972, there was no country called Ceylon anymore. The next empire that doesn't exist anymore is the Asante Empire in this part of Africa. This empire was pretty much Ghana, plus a little bit of Ivory Coast and a little bit of Togo. But why is this tiny country an empire? Because it was rich and it had a lot of gold. Everything is going well until the news gets to the British and they realize that this part of Africa has a lot of gold and they wanted some. In the year 1701, the British finally take over this empire and add it to theirs. This land remains in British hands until the year 1957, and eventually it gains independence and turns into Ghana. In the year 1958, two countries of Egypt and Syria decided to unite with each other and create a new country because they were sandwiching Israel. After this agreement, the United Arab Republic is formed. But it only lasts for 3 years. And the reason is that Syria believed that they had no true power over this country because everything was in Egypt's hand. Let's go to the south of Africa. There's a country here called Rhodesia. There was a British man by the name of Cecil Rhodes, and he was the one that claimed to have owned this place. I mean, under the British Empire, of course. And that is why his last name was on this country. And the name Rhodesia comes from his last name Rhodes. This name remains on this part of Africa until the year 1979. And eventually, in that same year, they gained independence from the British. And the new government wants to find a new name for their country that belongs to their culture, not the British. And they say Zimbabwe. Let's go back to the United States once again. We all know that in the 19th century, the Americans and the Spanish are fighting non-stop, and America's goal is to get the west part of it. One of those areas that the Americans wanted was Texas. It's interesting to note that in the 19th century, Texas was a part of the Spanish Empire called Mexico. And in the year 1836, they claim independence from Mexico and say we are a new country of Texas now. This was their flag as well. When the Americans saw that a section has separated from Mexico and they gained independence, they were more upset than the Mexicans. Then 9 years after this, the American government and army entered the state, and the Texan state didn't say anything about it, and they accept to be one of the new states to the American government.